She had kept the letter in her desk drawer for 11 days. Every morning before the hallways filled and the fluorescent lights flickered on and the sound of 200 teenagers began its low institutional roar, Nora Calloway had opened that drawer, read the letter she had already written, and closed it again. She had gone into room 214 and taught the American Civil War with the same steady voice she had been bringing to that room for 31 years. She had talked about Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation and the specific kind of moral courage that requires a person to act before the outcome is known. And then she had gone home to a house that had been too quiet since Daniel left, eaten whatever required the least effort, and lain awake in the dark, waiting for her own courage to catch up with her conviction. On the 12th morning, Nora picked up her pen and signed her name. Her hand did not tremble, not once, not even at the last letter. She would think about that later. Not the fear, which had been enormous and entirely real, but the steadiness. The specific gravity of a decision made completely down to the bone in the place where opinions cannot reach. She was 58 years old. She had spent 31 years building something at Jefferson Lincoln Regional High School that she had believed, with the particular naivety of someone who has been doing a thing well for a very long time, was too solid to be disassembled by a man with a budget spreadsheet and a room full of faculty who had learned to smile at bad news. She had been wrong about that. The meeting had been 3 weeks earlier. Principal Hardwick, Dennis Hardwick, whom she had watched walk into that school 12 years ago with the trim suit and the management vocabulary of someone who had studied leadership in a room that had never actually led. Anything had called a full humanities faculty meeting in the second-floor lounge, which smelled of microwave lunches and the particular despair of a department that had been underfunded for 7 consecutive years. He had stood at the front of the room with his reading glasses on a chain and his hands folded on the podium, and he had used the specific language that administrators use when they want to deliver a verdict while maintaining the fiction of consultation. The humanities curriculum would be consolidated. The history department would right-size. 2 positions would remain from the current 4. The displaced teachers would be offered exciting opportunities at the middle school in Rolla, teaching 7th grade geography and a course called Digital Citizenship. He had smiled when he said digital citizenship. A genuine smile. The smile of a man who had solved a problem and could not quite conceal his satisfaction about it. Nora had sat in the second row with her coffee in both hands and her 31 years arranged around her like the pieces of an identity being dismantled in front of witnesses. She had understood with a clarity that arrived cold and complete, the way the worst realizations always do, that she was not being offered one of the 2 remaining positions because Hardwick did not intend to offer her one. Not because her record was inadequate. Not because her students failed to thrive. Her students consistently outperformed every comparable district in the state on AP history, examinations, a fact that Hardwick knew and that had never once been mentioned in her performance evaluations, because it did not fit the narrative of a department that needed to be rationalized. The truth. The truth she had understood completely by the time she finished her coffee that afternoon was simpler and uglier than professional inadequacy. She was 58 years old. She asked questions in faculty meetings that required real answers. She had filed 2 formal grievances in the past decade over curriculum decisions that she believed and had been proven correct would harm her students. She had refused politely and thoroughly, and in writing, to participate in a grading normalization initiative that she had documented as academically indefensible. She had been, in the precise language of institutional management, difficult. The Rolla position was not a consolation prize. It was a sentence. Go gracefully to the middle school, teach content you don't know to students who don't need you. The way your students needed you. Watch the person you have spent 31 years becoming disappear into a building where your name means nothing, and do it without complaint. Because the alternative is being the difficult one again, and this time there are consequences designed specifically for you. She had driven home from that meeting with the windows down and the May air coming in warm off the Missouri River, and she had been for approximately 4 miles genuinely uncertain whether she was going to weep or be sick or both. Then she had crossed the bridge over the Moreau Creek, and something had shifted, not dramatically, not with any kind of epiphany. She had simply understood with a precision that surprised her what she was going to do. She was not going to Rolla. She had spent that night at her kitchen table writing a letter of resignation because she had reached the bottom of the alternatives, and the bottom turned out to be cleaner than she had expected. The decision had been in the end not difficult. It had only felt difficult from the outside. From the inside, from the place where she actually lived, it felt like setting down something she had not known she was still carrying. What she did not do, and this was deliberate, carefully deliberate, the product of 58 years of knowing her own vulnerabilities with the precision of a woman who has paid attention, was tell anyone. Not Claire, not Janet, not her brother Paul in Springfield, who would have driven up the same afternoon with his Buick, in his concern, in his very good intentions, that would have introduced doubt at exactly the moment she could not afford it. She had learned across her entire adult life that she was most susceptible to second-guessing herself in the exact moment before she was about to do something correct. And the people who loved her were also, without any malice whatsoever, the people most capable of manufacturing that doubt. She could not risk it. Not this time. So she signed the letter alone at 6:15 in the morning, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee, in the particular quiet of a house where only one person wakes up anymore. She drove to the school before Hardwick arrived. She set the letter in the center of his desk blotter with the deliberateness of someone placing the final stone. Then she drove back home and waited for her life to fall apart. It didn't fall apart. That was the strangest part of that morning, sitting in her kitchen with her coffee going cold, feeling underneath the very real terror of what she had just done, a relief so profound and so unexpected that it frightened her more than the resignation had. A bone-level unburdening. The specific physical sensation of setting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was a weight. The phone calls began before noon. Claire called first. Her daughter, 31 years old, living in St. Louis with a law degree and a network of school district contacts that a daughter probably should not have, but absolutely did. She had received intelligence before her own mother had said a word. The single syllable she led with "Mom" arrived with the compressed force of a woman who had already staged the conversation she was about to have. "Mrs. Peterson called me," Claire said. "I assumed she would. You resigned. Not a question. In accounting. Effective June 30th, yes." The silence on the other end had architecture, Claire building towards something. Measuring her approach, selecting the question that was actually an objection, wearing different clothes. "Why didn't you tell me you were thinking about this?" "Because I wasn't thinking about it," Nora said. "I decided. There's a difference. There's a significant difference, yes." What followed was the conversation she had anticipated in every detail. The emergency management voice Claire had inherited from her father, the calm assessment of a woman who has concluded that a situation requires careful handling and has already begun handling it. The questions arrived in order of apparent urgency: financial stability, health insurance, the wisdom of an unstructured retirement at 58 when 62 was the earliest she could touch her pension at a meaningful rate. Nora answered each one honestly, with the patience she had spent 3 decades perfecting, because Claire's alarm was not a character flaw. It was love expressing itself in the only vocabulary it had. And love, Nora had long since decided, deserved patience, especially when it was wrong. "I'm going to the cabin," she said when Claire had worked through the primary tier of her concerns. "Dad's cabin on the Osage. I'm going down for the summer." A beat, 2 beats. "That cabin hasn't been opened in 3 years. I'm aware." "Mom," Claire's voice shifted into something lower and more honest. "You are 58 years old and you are planning to go alone to an isolated cabin on a river in the middle of rural Missouri. What if the structure is compromised? What if something happens? What if—" "Claire," Nora's voice was gentle. It had the gentleness of someone who is not going to be argued out of a thing and knows it and is choosing kindness anyway. "I grew up on that river every summer of my childhood. I know quite a lot about the Osage, and I am 58, not 88. The numbers are meaningfully different." After Claire came Janet, her colleague of 17 years, whose concern came wrapped in the particular affection of someone who has watched you work and knows exactly what you are losing. Then Barbara from the County Historical Society. Then, because Claire had clearly issued deployment orders, her brother Paul from Springfield, who opened with the direct simplicity of a man who was worried and saw no advantage in disguising it. "Nora, what on earth are you doing?" She told them all the same thing in minor variations. She was going to the cabin. She was going to spend the summer on the river. She was not asking permission because she was a 58-year-old woman who had spent 3 decades making good decisions and was making another one now, and she needed them to trust that. When the call stopped, the kitchen was quiet in a way she had not heard it be quiet in years. Not the absence of Daniel quiet that had inhabited the house since the divorce. The silence of a space that had relearned how to belong to one person. Something different. the quiet of a woman who has finally stopped arguing with herself. She packed on Saturday with the systematic precision she had inherited from her father. Marcus Calloway had believed that a disorganized bag was the first symptom of a disorganized mind, and he had been right enough times that the principle had stuck. Clothes for variable weather, tools, hammer, screwdrivers, a pry bar she had taken from his garage at the estate sale 3 years ago and had been meaning to return to its proper place ever since. A first aid kit she actually knew how to use. 2 weeks of non-perishables. Her laptop, backup reading glasses, her father's road atlas because Marcus had believed with the conviction of a man who had driven his share of empty roads that you do not trust a single navigation system when the terrain is remote and the consequence of being wrong is sleeping in your car. She almost left without the box. It was in the hall closet, a medium-sized cardboard box she had brought from the cabin 3 years ago, after the estate settled, labeled in her own handwriting, Cabin Dad's Research. She had put it in the closet with the intention of opening it when she was ready. She had not been ready. 3 years had passed with the particular efficiency of years that are full of wrong things, and every time she had opened that closet for something else, she had been aware of the box, the way you are aware of things that require more of you than you currently have. She stood in the closet doorway and looked at it for a long moment. Then she lifted it and carried it to the Subaru and fitted in the trunk. She left Jefferson City on a clear Monday morning in early May, heading south. The drive was the drive of her childhood, the flatlands giving way to rolling hills south of Jefferson City, the hills steepening as the highway descended toward the Ozark uplift limestone, beginning to show its face in road cuts and bluffs. The cedar and oak thickening the green, deepening into something so saturated, it seemed improbable, the color of a place that has been growing things since before anyone was recording it. Marcus Calloway had driven this road every summer of her childhood with one hand on the wheel and the other pointing at something worth knowing about. A Cooper's hawk on a fence post, a thunderhead building over the western ridge, the particular quality of Ozark light in early May. She had loved this drive with the unexamined love of a child for the reliable things, and had forgotten in the years of not making it how much. The road into the cabin property had deteriorated since her last visit, 3 years of sycamore roots and seasonal heaving, and no vehicle weight to compact the gravel had returned the lane to something approaching its natural inclination, which was the natural inclination of a Missouri bottomland beginning to reclaim what had briefly been taken from it. She drove in at walking pace, feeling the Subaru move through ruts and soft spots, and she found she didn't mind. She had nowhere to be. That was new. It was strange. She was beginning to recognize it as exactly what she had chosen. The sycamores along the lane were magnificent. Marcus's word always for the largest ones, the ones that had been there longer than the road. Their bark peeled in the theatrical, decorative way of sycamores, their canopy so dense that the lane ran in something close to green twilight, even at mid-morning. He had told her once, she had been 12 sitting on the porch while he worked, that the sycamore was the most underappreciated tree in the eastern deciduous forest. People overlooked it because it grew in bottomlands they found unglamorous. But a large sycamore on a riverbank was one of the oldest living facts in an American landscape. You could read the history of a floodplain through a sycamore the way you read an era through its documents. Everything was a document to Marcus Calloway. Everything was a primary source if you knew how to read it. She had become a history teacher. It was not a coincidence. When the lane broke through the sycamore corridor and the clearing opened onto the riverbank, she stopped the car and did not get out. The cabin was still itself. Her grandfather's white oak and cedar, her father's covered porch facing the water. The building's proportion against the tree line, exactly as she had always known it. 3 years had bent the south railing and darkened the cedar shake and pushed a sycamore branch into the roofline. But the shape was the same. The particular way the morning light crossed the river and struck the west-facing window, the window beside which Marcus had always set his canvas chair, was the same. She had loved this place since before she had language for loving a place. She had loved it, and then she had not been able to come back to it because coming back meant arriving in the presence of his absence. In Jefferson City, his absence was ambient and general. It was everywhere and nowhere in particular, which made it bearable. Here it would be specific. Here it would be in every chair and every shelf, in the binoculars by the door, and the handwriting on the supply shed, in the sound of the river that she had learned to hear through his description of it before she heard it for herself. She had not been ready. She sat in the car with the engine off, and the river audible through the open windows, and she understood, with the simple authority of a fact that has finally arrived at its full weight, that she was ready now. Not because the grief had become smaller, because she had run out of ways to be anywhere else. She got out of the car. She stood in the clearing and let the full weight of his absence arrive at its actual force, the force she had been managing and redirecting and not quite allowing for 3 years. And it was worse than she had prepared herself for, and also in the way that real things always are better, more survivable, more honest. She took one long breath. She started making her list. The inspection took an hour. She circled the structure with the methodical attention she had learned from the man who had built the porch, walking the perimeter, cataloging each problem by urgency and by what she could address alone versus what would require another pair of hands. The south railing separated at the post and leaning toward disaster. Two sections of cedar shake missing on the east slope. The northwest sycamore branch in direct contact with the roofline, a chainsaw problem, and she didn't have a chainsaw. The screen door hanging off its lower hinge. None of it was catastrophic. The frame was sound. The foundation was solid. The problems were surface and correctable given time and willingness to work. She had both. Inside dust cedar, the particular damp of a closed river building, and underneath both of those, something she had not been prepared for. Not sentiment, not imagination, but the demonstrable physical truth that a person who occupies a space for decades leaves something behind that outlasts their physical presence. Her father's canvas chair still beside the window. His bookshelves still organized in his system, not alphabetical, but thematic and chronological within each theme, which she had thought eccentric as a child and now recognized as exactly correct. 3 pairs of binoculars by the door because Marcus had believed with evangelical certainty that a person should never be more than arm's reach from a good pair of binoculars. She stood in the middle of the main room and let the full weight of the absence settle into the space alongside her. It occurred to her for the first time that her father had been a high school history teacher for 30 years before he retired, that she had followed him into that life, that she had never once in 31 years asked him whether he had chosen it or simply arrived at it the way you arrive at the life that has been assembling itself around you while you were paying attention to other things. There were a great many things she had never asked him. She had always assumed there would be more time. She opened the windows. She started a list. She got to work. The water system first because Marcus had taught her water is always first. The gravity-fed spring line from the hill had a section loose from its bracket, visible through the undergrowth, reachable, with a scramble up the slope, fixable in 40 minutes, with a pipe clamp from the supply shed once she found where he had kept the pipe clamps. She did it herself, got her hands cold and muddy in the spring water, barked one knuckle against the limestone when the clamp slipped and felt when she turned the kitchen tap and water ran clear and cold, a satisfaction entirely disproportionate to the difficulty of the task. That was the point she understood standing at the tap watching the water run. The satisfaction was not proportionate to clamping a pipe. It was proportionate to the reminder that she could do things, real things with her hands, with what was available in a place that asked nothing of her except competence and patience and the willingness to get scraped. No committee approval, no curriculum alignment document, no administrator's smile that meant the opposite of what smiles were supposed to mean. She made lunch and ate it on the porch. A great blue heron stood on the gravel bar below with the prehistoric patience of a creature that had been doing exactly this since before the concept of patience existed. She was watching the heron and thinking about her father watching herons from this same chair for 60 years when she heard the truck coming down the lane. A faded green F-150 old in every panel pulled into the cleared area near the supply shed. A man got out, tall, lean, silver-haired, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who has been physically capable for so long he no longer thinks about it. He was carrying a covered casserole dish. Somewhere in his early 70s, she estimated, though he moved a decade younger. He saw her on the porch and raised the casserole dish slightly, a gesture that was simultaneously greeting, explanation, and an invitation not to be alarmed, and came to the steps. "Walt Briggs," he said, "I'm on the hill north side of the property line." He nodded in that direction. "I saw your car come in. Your father always brought something when a neighbor showed up new to the season." Nora came down to meet him. "Nora Calloway. Marcus was my father. I know who you are." He extended a hand, large, rough-palmed, the hand of someone who has spent a career working with physical systems. "He talked about you, said you were the history teacher." "Was," she said. "As of last month, I'm not anything in particular." He studied her with the level, unhurried attention of a man who stopped performing socialese some time ago and has been the better for it. Early retirement. Early and contested, she said, by everyone except me. Something at the corner of his mouth made a movement that was not quite a smile but was moving in its direction. Marcus said you were direct. He also told me the roof was in decent shape, she said. He was wrong about that too. This time the almost smile became the genuine article brief and real. He handed her the casserole. East slope 2 sections. I could see it from the hill in March. A pause that was not uncomfortable. I can foot the ladder when you're ready to address it. She held the dish and looked at him for a moment. I'd appreciate that. Week from Saturday if the weather holds. Week from Saturday, she agreed. He turned and walked back to his truck without ceremony. She watched the F-150 disappear into the sycamores, then went inside and ate the chicken and dumplings at the table by the window. They were extraordinary, the food of someone who has been cooking for one person for long enough that the cooking has become its own answer to loneliness rather than a reminder of it. Claire called at 7, the relief in her voice audible before she said a word. You got there. I got here. The cabin is structurally sound. Water is running. I ate neighbor food for dinner. You have a neighbor. Walt Briggs, retired engineer, new dad, is going to help with the roof. She paused. I told you I'd be all right. You told me you'd assess the situation when you arrived. A small silence. How are you, Mom? Not practically. Nora looked out at the river going dark in the evening. The heron still on its gravel bar, waiting with the patience of something that has never had a reason to rush. I'm in the right place, she said. I don't know yet what that means, but I'm in the right place. That isn't especially reassuring. It's accurate. Those aren't the same thing. After she hung up, she sat in her father's canvas chair for a long time with the windows open and the river sound coming through the screens. That night she slept 8 hours without interruption, without dreaming, without waking once to think about Hardwick or Rolla or digital citizenship or the 31 years of professional identity she had set on an administrator's desk blotter and walked away from. The river was enough. For the first time in 11 days, the river was simply enough. The days that followed had a quality she recognized from her childhood summers and had not thought about in years' time, moving slowly enough to be distinguished each hour separate from the one before it by the quality of the light and the temperature of the air and the particular mood of the river below the bank. She was not used to it. 31 years of scheduled time had made her chronically clock-aware, and she caught herself the second morning checking her watch at 8:15 for a class she no longer had. She went to work on the cabin instead. The south porch railing shimmed and re-nailed over a morning's careful effort. The screen door frame hung level by mid-afternoon. Inside, she cleaned with the thoroughness of someone who understands that the condition of a space communicates something before a word is spoken. And Marcus Calloway had kept this cabin the way he kept everything, in a condition that announced his respect for it. She found things while she cleaned. A coffee can in the shed holding soil samples, each labeled in his handwriting with a location and a date going back to 1991. A box of surveying stakes color-coded in a system she couldn't immediately parse. 3 spiral notebooks in the work table drawer, 2 filled in his dense field note script, 1 half-finished, the last entry dated the May of his final year. She opened the half-finished notebook. The handwriting was his precise, slightly smaller when he was concentrating, but the content was different from the field journal she had read as a child, different from bird observations and water levels and the seasonal moods of the river. This was something else entirely. May 14th, she read, spoke again with Thomas Redcloud at the OCN Cultural Center. He confirmed that the section of river between Shell City and the Old Brashear Ford matches the described route in the 1811 Pike Expedition Notes, which puts the winter camp within a half-mile of this property. Have submitted the coordinates to the State Archaeological Survey. No response in 6 weeks. Thomas says this is normal. I am learning to find normal unacceptable. She read that last sentence twice. She set the notebook down. She could feel the pull of it, the specific pull of a door she was not yet prepared to walk through, and she had enough self-knowledge to recognize that some things require approach from the right direction in the right state of mind, or you miss the thing that matters. She was not in the right state of mind. She had arrived 3 days ago, still vibrating with the residue of 11 days of calculated tension, and she had not yet fully settled into the slower rhythm this place required. She needed a few more days of physical work first. Roof and railing and pipe clamps. The specific reassurance of simple competence, the kind that doesn't require a credential or a performance review, just a person and a problem, and the skills to address one with the other. She closed the notebook. She made tea. She went to the porch and watched a belted kingfisher work the near bank with the focused, percussive intensity of something that was born knowing exactly what it was for. She had a primary source in the work table drawer. She was going to read it, but not yet. Walt came on the Wednesday before his proposed Saturday, arriving at 7:30 in the morning with a chainsaw in the truck bed and the easy manner of a man who has made his peace with every kind of weather. "Branch first," he said by way of greeting. "Rain coming Thursday. Better to clear the contact points and tarp the compromised sections before it gets here." She hadn't checked any forecast. "Significant rainfall," he said, "Thursday and into Friday." She didn't ask how he knew. She had grown up with a man who read weather through the sky and the birds and the pressure in his sinuses, and she recognized the type. They worked together with the natural efficiency of two people who have each been competent alone for long enough that cooperation requires no negotiation. She footed the ladder. He made the cuts. They cleared the debris together without working against each other. He handled the chainsaw with the deliberateness of someone who respects a tool and has the evidence of the time he didn't. His left hand, two fingers, index and ring shortened at the tips. The pale linear scar of an old industrial wound healed clean and functional. She saw it when they were stacking brush. She didn't ask. He explained anyway without drama. "Hydraulic engineering," he said. "Pump housing failure in 1987 lost the tips." He held up the hand matter of fact. "Still have the important ones." "Hydraulic engineering," she said. "Water systems. River management primarily. Course of engineers 30 years. Flood control navigation channels, environmental assessment." He gathered a section of brush. "The Osage among others." She straightened. "You worked on the Osage in the 60s and 70s. He said what came next with the specific flatness of a practiced restraint over something considerably less flat. "Before Truman Dam." Anyone who had grown up on this river knew about Truman Dam, the reservoir that had covered 60,000 acres of valley, 76 community cemeteries, bottomland, that had been someone's home, and then someone's memory, and then, by institutional decree, somebody else's recreation area. She also knew the particular silence that tends to surround the men who built it, not shame exactly, but something that lives in the same neighborhood. "I was 26 when I started on that project," Walt said. "I was not old enough to understand what I was helping to build." She was quiet. That was the right response. "My father was researching the pre-colonial Osage settlements along this stretch," she said after a moment. "I found his notebooks." Walt looked at her with his unhurried, direct attention. "I know," he said. "We corresponded the last 4 years of his life." The vertigo was immediate and specific, the particular disorientation of discovering that the person you believed you knew completely had a dimension you had never seen. 4 years of letters. Her father corresponding with the man on the hill about something she had not known was happening. "He never mentioned you," she said. "He was working something out," Walt said simply. "He didn't talk about it until he had something to say." She thought about the notebook. "I am learning to find normal unacceptable." "He was trying to get someone to pay attention," she said, "to what he'd found. He found something worth paying attention to." Walt picked up the chainsaw. Whether anyone pays attention is a different question. Generally depends on who's doing the asking. He looked at her directly. History teachers sometimes have better luck than retired engineers. He went back to work. Nora stood in the debris field with the sound of the chainsaw and the river below the bank and the full weight of her father's hidden 4 years pressing against the closed box in her trunk. She walked to the Subaru. She opened the trunk. She lifted the box. She carried it inside and set it on the work table and stood looking at her own handwriting on the top cabin dad's research. She didn't open it yet, but she stopped pretending she wasn't going to. The rain came on Thursday exactly as Walt had predicted. She had tarped the roof sections the afternoon before nailing the grommets down with more overlap than strictly necessary, because Marcus Calloway's principle about preparation had always been, assume the situation will be worse than forecast and proceed from there. It was worse than forecast. The rain began at 3 in the morning with the unhurried confidence of something that has decided it is going to do this and is not interested in being reasoned with. She woke to it on the metal roof, which had the acoustic quality her father had always described as the finest alarm clock on the Osage River. By 6, what had started as steady, moderate rainfall had become something the weather radio called a high precipitation event with potential for localized flooding. She put on her rain jacket and went to the bank to check the reference peg she'd driven in 2 nights before. 6 inches above baseline since 11 o'clock. Not alarming. Information. She went inside and looked at the box. She had been circling it for 4 days with the thoroughness of someone who knows that when she opens it, something is going to change, and she has been managing the pace at which things change. But there was nothing left to manage. The physical work of the cabin was essentially complete. The rain made outdoor work impossible, and the box was sitting on the work table in the specific patient way of things that are waiting for you to stop stalling. She made coffee, she sat down, she opened it. What she found inside was not what she had expected. Not the accumulated papers of a man's retirement, not birding notes or garden records or the kind of organized sentimentality that people sometimes mistake for legacy. What she found was 4 years of serious, systematic, documented work. The work of someone who had identified a problem, assessed what was known about it, located the gaps in the existing record, and spent 4 summers methodically filling them. 14 maps, hand-drawn on quality drafting paper in her father's careful cartographic hand, the drafting of a man who has patience and a steady eye, and the willingness to correct without tearing the paper. Each map covered a section of the Osage River Valley. Modern landmarks were rendered in pencil for orientation roads, fence lines, occasional structures. Over them in ink, a second layer of marks, village sites, midden locations, trail routes, seasonal ford crossings, burial grounds. Each mark was keyed to a reference number, and the reference numbers corresponded to a typed index, 2 pages single-spaced, each entry citing a primary source with the addition page number in the location where Marcus had accessed it. The sources were what stopped her. Spanish expedition records from 1719, predating American contact in this region by nearly a century. Pike's journals from 1806. The reports of George Sibley, who had traveled the Osage country in 1811 and taken meticulous notes on the settlements along this specific stretch of river. Federal Land Survey records from 1821, the year the Osage had ceded most of their territory under the sustained and organized pressure of a government that was not going to stop applying it. In 23 letters of correspondence, some handwritten, some printed email with the Osage Nation Cultural Center spanning 7 years. 7 years. Starting the summer after he retired. He had been doing this for 7 years without telling anyone in his family. The last map was at the bottom of the box. Unfinished, some marks inked, others only penciled. It covered the section of valley that included the cabin property. Clipped to it in his handwriting, this section contains the strongest evidence for a significant winter habitation site circa 1780 to 1810. The landform features elevated bank, south-facing exposure, spring access, sheltered tributary match, all criteria documented by Sibley and confirmed by Thomas Redcloud. Coordinates submitted to the Missouri State Archaeological Survey, May 2021. No response. Will follow up. This matters. He had died in June of 2021, 3 weeks after writing those words. She sat at the work table with her father's unfinished map in front of her, and the rain coming hard on the metal roof and the river continuing its quiet, measured rise outside the window. She sat there for a long time, not thinking exactly, but allowing something to become visible that had not been visible before. The understanding of a thing taking its full shape, the way a developing photograph finally resolves into a clear image. She understood exactly what she was doing here. Not abstractly, not metaphorically. She was here because Marcus Calloway had spent the last 4 years of his life building an argument he had not been able to finish, and he had left the unfinished argument in this specific place where she would find it when she was ready. And she was ready. And the argument needed to be finished by someone who knew how to finish it. She had spent 31 years teaching students to build historical arguments, how to locate a primary source, assess its reliability, place it in context, construct the case that connects evidence to interpretation, to conclusion in a chain that a skeptical reader cannot legitimately dismiss. She had done this in classrooms with chalk, and then with projectors, and then with document cameras, with students who sometimes understood immediately and sometimes didn't for a while. With the patient persistence of someone who believes that the skill matters whether or not the student is yet sure it does. She was a history teacher. She had been a history teacher all along. She spent the next 9 days reading. Not quickly, she had taught students for 3 decades that you do not read a primary source quickly, that the value of primary source material is precisely in what it shows you when you read it with full attention, which means slowly, which means multiple times, which means sitting with the parts that don't yet make sense instead of skipping to the parts that do. She read the 3 notebooks completely. the correspondence file from first letter to last. She pulled up 3 digitized documents in the University of Missouri's library system. She studied all 14 maps with a magnifying glass from her father's supply drawer. By the end of those 9 days, she had a clearer picture of what Marcus had built than she suspected anyone else had, because she had the full collection, the inside and the outside the data, and the thinking beneath the data. On the 10th morning, she picked up the phone and called Thomas Redcloud. He answered on the second ring. His voice was the measured, careful voice of a man who has learned to be cautious in initial conversations with non-Osage researchers, and she recognized the caution immediately for what it was: not hostility, but earned precision. The precision of someone who has been burned by people who arrived with good intentions and left having used something they were given in trust. "I'm Nora Calloway," she said. "Marcus's daughter. I'm at the cabin. I've read all the notebooks." A pause that was not indifference but assessment. "He said you'd come," Thomas said. "He wasn't sure when. He said you'd need time." 3 years, she said. "I'm a slow starter." She heard something shift, the specific adjustment of wariness, withdrawing slightly from a person it has concluded is not a threat. "He said you were direct." "He told me you were patient," she said. "I'm going to need both of us to be both things if we're going to finish this." A breath. "The Winter Village site," he said after a moment. He was close. The landform markers matched the oral tradition accounts from the early reservation period, 3 families whose histories referenced that exact configuration of spring access and riverbank and elevated exposure. "That's not coincidence. That's memory." "I understand the distinction," she said, "between coincidence and memory. I spent 31 years teaching students to make exactly that distinction." She paused. "I've read the full correspondence file. I know the history with the State Archaeological Survey. I know what he submitted and when and what they returned." She let a beat pass. "I'm not a state agency. I'm a retired history teacher with a complete set of research notebooks, a meticulous evidentiary index, and the time for the first time in my adult life to do one thing correctly instead of 30 things adequately." He was quiet with the quality of a man arriving at a decision. "I'll drive up next week," he said. "Wednesday. I want to walk the property and see the field maps in person." "I'll have coffee ready," she said. "And I should tell you that there's a retired hydrological engineer named Walt Briggs who lives on the hill above the property. He spent 30 years with the Corps working this river, and he corresponded with my father for the last 4 years of his life." She paused. "He's part of this if you're willing." A longer pause with weight in it. "Walt Briggs testified at the Truman Dam environmental hearings in 1969, Thomas said slowly. "He was the only Corps engineer who told the committee that the reservoir would flood 17 known cultural sites. He told me he was 26 when he started on that project," Nora said, "that he was not old enough to understand what he was helping to build. Some people spend the rest of their lives trying to account for that. I think he's been trying for 50 years. "Wednesday," Thomas said, 10 o'clock. 2 days later, while they were finishing the work on the brush pile, Walt said something that reorganized the morning. "Your father asked me to watch the property." Nora stopped. "Not formally," Walt said. "We had been corresponding for 2 years. He knew I was on the hill. He said if Nora comes while I'm not here to tell her myself, I want someone to know she's there." He set a section of branch with his precise economy. "He thought you'd come before he died. He wanted to tell you about the research himself." She looked at the cabin. At the work table visible through the window, the open box, the 14 maps now spread and studied and annotated in pencil with her own notes. "He ran out of time," she said. "He did." Walt was quiet. "He also believed that if you came after when you were ready, you would find it, and you would understand what to do with it. Because you're a history teacher, and he said history teachers understand that a document is worth nothing if nobody reads it." The morning was still except for the river below the bank and the wind in the sycamores overhead. She thought about a man driving 3 hours each way from Jefferson City for 4 summers alone to build something in a place where the light came through the window just right and the river told you things if you paid attention. "He was right," she said. "He usually was," Walt said. "About most things." Thomas Redcloud arrived at 10:02 in a silver Camry parking with the unhurried economy that characterized everything else about him: compact, deliberate, no wasted motion. He was in his mid-50s with the composed alertness of a man who has spent a career navigating institutions that require exceptional precision from him to function with any fairness at all. He carried a leather portfolio that showed years of careful use. He looked at the cabin, then at the river, then at Nora on the porch steps. "He described you well," Thomas said. "He described you the same way." She extended her hand. "This is Walt Briggs." The two men looked at each other with the weight of people who know each other's history without having previously occupied the same room. Thomas studied Walt with the evaluating attention of a man who has learned over a long career to distinguish between people who say they are accounting for something and people who have organized their entire working life around the accounting. 1969, Thomas said. I've been accounting for it since, Walt said. Thomas appeared to conclude something about whether this was true. Let's walk the property, he said. They went north along the bank first, then turned east up the tributary at the property's edge. Nora carried her father's last map. Thomas carried his portfolio. Walt moved through the terrain with the ease of someone who has been reading landscapes in terms of hydraulics for 50 years and is now rereading the same landscape in a different language, listening for what it says in terms of habitation, and use the particular intelligence of people who organize their entire relationship with the natural world around paying close attention to it over a very long time. The tributary ran clear and cold over limestone. The banks were hung with fern and water willow. 200 yards in the valley narrowed the limestone pushed through the soil on the north bank, and the spring emerged from a fissure in the rock face, a clean, continuous, cold thread of water. The kind of spring that has been flowing since before anyone in this valley kept a written record of anything. Thomas stopped at the spring and did not move for a long time. He looked at the rock face. He looked at the configuration of red limestone and cedar overhang and the south-facing slope across the tributary. He opened his portfolio and consulted something she couldn't see. He looked at the spring again with the attention of someone checking a long-held memory against a present fact. The oral tradition accounts, he said finally, his voice quiet, directed at the water rather than at them, from 3 separate family histories. They all describe a water source with this precise relationship to the hillside. Red rock, cedar overhang, the particular way the water comes out of the stone. He touched the rock face briefly with a care that was not theatrical, but was clearly something more than gesture. The families who came here before removal, their descendants carry this, not as history, as home. Walt stood a few feet back with the expression of a man in the middle of an accounting that has no clean resolution. The reservoir, Nora said carefully, 4 miles south. 2 summer dispersal sites, Thomas said, under 30 feet of water since 1964. We know precisely where they are. We cannot reach them. We can document them and push for recognition, but the water has them. He looked at the spring, which is why this site matters. This section is intact. The landform is intact. The spring is intact. Because it's private land, Walt said. Your grandfather's, then your father's, yours now. Nora had not thought about it in those terms until that precise moment. The specific, improbable luck of private ownership maintaining the integrity of a place that would otherwise have been subdivided or developed, or simply altered by the ordinary indifference of people who don't know what's there and have no reason to care. Thomas looked at her directly. What do we do with the knowing? She looked at the spring, the water coming out of the rock in its steady thread, the same water that had emerged from the same fissure for how many thousands of years, indifferent to everything that had happened at its margins. We write the argument, she said, the full argument. My father built the evidentiary foundation. What it needs is the interpretation, the framing the case that goes to the State Archaeological Survey and the federal review process, and eventually to the public. She paused. That's what a history teacher does. Thomas held her gaze. All right, he said. They walked back to the cabin. Nora made coffee. They spread the maps on the work table. They went to work. The work settled into a rhythm over the following 10 days that Nora recognized from her best years in the classroom, the rhythm of a problem being seriously addressed by people who each bring something necessary that the others lack. Thomas drove up from the cultural center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Walt came down from the hill on most mornings, contributing what neither Nora nor Thomas had independently, a hydrologist's complete understanding of how this particular river had moved and changed over 2 centuries. He could look at a cut bank and tell you what decade had shaped it. He could read a gravel bar the way Nora read a primary source, not for what it said on the surface, but for what it showed about the forces that had shaped it over time. Together, you're essentially what your father was trying to be, Thomas told her one afternoon, watching Walt explain the hydraulic evidence for the original channel location. He didn't have the technical knowledge. He was compensating with very careful measurement and a lot of miles on his boots. He would have found it eventually, Nora said. Probably. Thomas looked at Walt's annotated sketch. This is faster. Nora built the written argument the way she had always built historical analysis: claim, evidence, interpretation, acknowledgement of counterarguments, direct response. She wrote clearly and without excess because she had spent 31 years teaching students that the persuasive force of an argument is inversely proportional to its unnecessary length. If you have the evidence, make the claim. If you are not making the claim, you don't have the evidence yet. She made the case for the Winter Village site in 23 pages. Thomas read the draft on a Thursday afternoon sitting at the work table while Nora deliberately absented herself to the porch. He read it 3 times. A serious reader who reads something 3 times without speaking is either deeply troubled or deeply impressed. "This is very good," he said when she came back in. "You cite the oral tradition accounts correctly as corroboration rather than primary evidence in the Western legal and academic sense, with a note that from the Osage perspective, the oral tradition is the primary evidence and the written documents are the corroboration. That framing came from your February 2020 letter," she said, "to my father. You said it better than I could." He looked at her. "You're giving me authorship credit." Collaborative research has collaborative authorship. That's accuracy, not generosity. He was quiet for a moment. "Marcus raised you well." "He taught history for 30 years, she said. "He taught it the right way. Some of it got into the furniture." It was while she was reading the first notebook for the second time more slowly, the way second readings always yield what first readings miss, that she found the entry that changed the weight of everything. It was in the middle of the second summer following the first rejection from the State Archaeological Survey, a form letter diplomatically worded explaining that the submission did not meet the current review threshold. Marcus had written about his frustration with the contained, organized precision of a man who has found something that matters and cannot make the relevant institutions agree. And then in smaller writing at the bottom of the page, in the tight, slightly angular script he used when he was thinking rather than reporting. "I think Nora could do this. She has the argument, and she has 30 years of practice making people understand why history is not merely past. She could make this matter to people who don't yet understand that it should. I need to find the right moment to tell her about the research. I need to find the right moment, and I need to find it before I run out of moments." He had written those words in the summer of 2019. He had died in June of 2021. He had not found the right moment. She sat with the notebook in her hands for a long time. She considered being angry. The anger would have had legitimate targets, and she was not a person who lacked the capacity for it. The survey's indifference, the school district's small-minded accounting, the 3 years she had spent at the wrong distance from this place, from this box, from a conversation her father had been building toward. But the anger felt beside the point. He had built something for her to find. He had trusted she would find it. He had told the person he was working with that she was coming. He had believed on the evidence of 31 years of watching her that she would know what to do. That was not failure. That was her father knowing her better than she had known herself. She could work with that. She closed the notebook. She picked up her pencil. She made a list of the things that needed to happen next. In the first notebook on a page in the middle of the second summer, he had written about the specific quality of patience required for this kind of work. Not the patience of someone who is waiting, the patience of someone who is building, which is a different thing entirely. Waiting is passive. Building under uncertainty is active in a way that requires constant management of the impulse to give up. He had written, "The argument will stand, or it will not stand, on the basis of what I can document. I am not responsible for what the institution does with the argument. I am responsible for the argument. This distinction is taking me longer to internalize than it should." She had taught this distinction to AP students for 15 years. She had explained it in the context of the civil rights movement that the people making the argument are responsible for the quality of the argument, not for the speed at which the institution that must receive it catches up to what the argument requires. She had taught this principle with the confident authority of someone explaining something she understood theoretically. She was now beginning to understand it in her body, in the way that things you have taught often eventually require you to learn. The correspondence file was extraordinary in ways she had not fully grasped on the first reading. What she saw now on the second pass through was not just 2 people exchanging information, but 2 people building a methodology together. One from the inside of the history, one from the outside, each bringing something the other lacked, each checking the other's work in the way that real intellectual partnership requires. Thomas had been cautious at the beginning. Not hostile, never rude, always substantive, but precise about what he shared and careful about what he offered. He was testing across those early letters whether Marcus was the kind of person who would use the history in service of the history or in service of his own interest in it. Those were two different things. Thomas had seen enough of the second kind to be careful about assuming he was looking at the first. Marcus had understood the test. She could see it in how his letters evolved across those 7 years, moving from researcher to collaborator, from person seeking information to person accountable to the information. He had written in a letter from the spring of 2018, "I want to be clear that nothing from this research will be published, submitted, or shared beyond our correspondence without your review and approval. The history belongs to the people who lived it. I am only attempting to establish the physical evidence that supports what your community already knows." Thomas had written back in his careful, precise hand, "That is the correct understanding. Let's keep working." She read the full correspondence file in one long evening, the windows open, the river audible in the dark beyond the screens. By the time she turned the last page, she understood something Thomas had said to her on the phone. He said, "You were direct." Marcus had not simply described her. He had been preparing Thomas for her arrival, building toward her, setting up the partnership she would need before she knew she needed it, in the letters of a man who had apparently understood his daughter well enough to know when she would arrive and what she would require. The invitation had been in the box all along, and in the days between Thomas's first visit and the one that changed everything, the visit in the third week of May, the one with the photographs Nora built, the written argument, the way she had always built her best teaching materials, systematically with the evidence organized before the prose began, so that the writing was the expression of a thing already known rather than the discovery of a thing not yet found. Walt came down on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, arriving with a thermos and his annotated copy of the channel migration data he had been accumulating from core records since 1965. He could account for the river's movement across 200 years in terms of specific hydrological events, the flood years, the drought years, the channel shifts that had relocated the main current by 100 yards in a single season. He could explain why the landform on the north tributary had the specific configuration it had: elevated, bank-sheltered aspect, spring access, flat ground above the floodline. It was not accident. It was the result of 1,000 years of the river making the same decision about where to cut and where to deposit. The people who had lived here had read the same landscape. They had understood it completely. They had built their winter habitations on ground that the river itself had organized high enough to be safe, low enough to be sheltered, with water access that did not require a long walk in January. You did not accidentally put a winter camp on ground like that. You put a winter camp there because you had been watching the river long enough to understand what it was telling you. "Your father measured every inch of this bank," Walt said one morning, looking at the notebook's field measurements. He didn't have the hydrological modeling to know what he was looking at in technical terms, but he knew it was right. He knew it was right because Thomas knew it was right, Nora said. They were confirming each other from different directions. "That's what good research looks like," Walt said. "Yes," she said, "that's what it looks like." She wrote 23 pages. She wrote them in 6 days, in the mornings at the work table by the window with the river below and the coffee beside her and her father's mechanical pencil in her hand. The argument was clean, direct, and organized in the sequence that historical arguments require: the what, the where, the when, the evidence for all three, the interpretation of the evidence, the acknowledgement of what the counterarguments would be, and the reasons they did not hold. She was doing precisely what she had spent 31 years teaching others to do. She had just never until now had the right subject. The second flood came without warning. That was the difference between the two floods. The first had announced itself with days of steady rain, a weather radio alert, a gradual and visible buildup she had tracked in real time from the porch. The second arrived in darkness and silence, which meant it was moving with a different kind of force. The headwater surge was larger. The timeline was compressed. And the warning, when it finally came, arrived in the form of a sound, or rather the absence of one. Her father had told her about this. She had been 9 years old, sitting on the porch of the same cabin, while Marcus stood at the bank in the last of the evening light, and he had said, "When the Osage goes quiet in the night, when the sound of the current, which you have been hearing at the edge of your awareness for days, simply stops, the silence is information. It means one of two things. Either the flow has been interrupted by something lodged in the channel upstream, or the headwaters have received so much rain so fast that the pulse is still moving down the valley and the sound hasn't arrived yet. In either case, when the river goes quiet, you go to the window. She went to the window. It was 2:15 in the morning. The three-quarter moon gave enough light to see the outline of the bank, and what she saw was that the bank had changed its shape. The gravel bar that had extended into the channel was submerged. The willow at the water's edge was standing in 3 feet of water that had not existed 6 hours earlier, when she had done her last evening check of the reference peg. She pulled on her clothes, boots, rain jacket, flashlight. She went outside and drove the peg, 22 inches above her May baseline, rising, and she could see it moving, not dramatically, not like a movie, but in the specific, relentless way of a river that has made a decision. She measured the distance from the foundation to her grandfather's 1993 high water mark on the north wall, 51 inches. She had 29 inches of margin, but the first flood had given her days of warning. This one had arrived in silence in the middle of the night, which meant it was moving faster and meant the peak was closer than she wanted it to be. She called Walt. He answered on the first ring. "I see it," he said. The same 3 words as the first flood. NWS pushed an emergency flash flood alert 20 minutes ago. Whitman's Creek tributary 8 miles north. 11 inches of rain in 4 hours. A pause. "I'm getting in the truck." "Walt?" 7 minutes. The line went dead. She stood in the yard with the flashlight and thought with a calm that surprised her about what needed to happen in the next 7 minutes. Not dramatically, not with the performed fear of a person trying to rise to an occasion. The fear was real. She was a woman who had been afraid of fast water since she was 7 years old, since a canoe on a rapid that had promised to be manageable and wasn't 4 seconds underwater, in which the universe rearranged itself around the question of whether she was going to come up. She had been afraid of fast water for 51 years. The river was already 22 inches above its May baseline and still rising in the dark. But she was also occupied, and occupied fear transforms. She went to the work table. 14 maps, 3 notebooks, the correspondence file, the source index, her father's annotated bibliography, the photographs from the cultural center, the survey notes Walt had written in his precise technical hand. Everything irreplaceable was on that table, Marcus Calloway's 4 years and her own 3 weeks of building on top of them. Everything needed to go before she did. She pulled the 2 large plastic storage bins from the supply shed, her father's bins labeled in his handwriting on a strip of masking tape, "Cabin Emergency." Of course he had prepared for this. Of course he had. She lined both bins with contractor garbage bags sealed at the top with duct tape. She packed the maps flat in the first bin, notebooks and files stacked in the second, photographs layered between sheets of paper towel. She ran 2 wraps of duct tape per seam on each bin. She carried them to the Subaru parked on the highest ground near the porch and loaded them in the trunk. 27 minutes start to finish. Walt's headlights came through the sycamores at 2:48, cutting the dark in sharp diagonals through the leaves. Nora was at the reference peg when he pulled up. She read him the number without preamble. 31 inches. He got out of the truck and stood at the bank and looked at the river without speaking for a moment. The river that had been there 3 weeks ago. The spring river, clear and green over gravel, running with the unhurried confidence of something entirely at ease in its own direction, was gone. In its place, a different water, copper-colored and opaque, with suspended sediment, fast and purposeful, and carrying debris she could hear before she could see it, the clatter and knock of wood against wood in the current, the hiss of silt moving under turbulent water, and upstream, working its way down the channel, with the patient authority of something that has gathered enough force to go wherever it chooses. Something large, a tree section, or a chunk of undercut bank rolling forward in the dark. "Bigger than the first one," she said, significantly. He watched the surface with the professional stillness of a man who has spent 50 years studying moving water and understands that you learn more from watching than from reacting. Whitman's Creek floods fast and drops fast. This is a pulse flood, sharp peak, rapid recession. The question is how high the peak comes. She looked at the north wall. 51 inches to the mark. I'm at 31. He ran the calculation in his head. She could see it happening. The hydraulic model, the watershed area, the precipitation rate, the time delay between peak rainfall and peak flow on a tributary of this size. "It'll be close," he said. "We need to prepare the cabin." "What's still to move?" "What's already moved?" "Research materials. Everything irreplaceable is in the trunk." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of respect. Not announced, not performed, just present in the steadiness of his attention. "Then we prepare what's left, and we wait." They had 40 minutes, maybe less. Walt moved through the cabin with the efficiency of a man who has done this before and understands the physics of what water does when it enters a low structure. He knew where it would come first, under the kitchen door, the sill being the lowest point. He muscled the wood stove's cedar surround up onto the fireplace hearth, using a section of old porch railing as a lever. Nora cleared the kitchen cabinets to the upper shelves. She secured the lower doors with bungee cord from the supply shed. She packed her personal essentials into the waterproof dry bag from her father's closet laptop. Medications, the cabin's property deed, her father's death certificate, a small stack of documents from Jefferson City. She moved quickly and without panic. She had stopped being afraid sometime around the wood stove. Not because the situation had improved, the river was continuing to rise, and the sounds it was making in the dark outside were not small sounds. But fear has a different quality when you are in motion. It sharpens into attention, and attention is useful. She was useful. She was doing what needed doing in the order it needed doing without wasting time on the emotional performance of being in a serious situation. There was a difference between feeling fear and being governed by it. She was 58 years old. She had learned the difference. At 3:40, Walt read the peg. 43 inches, he called from the northeast corner. 8 inches to the 1993 mark. She came to stand beside him. They looked at the river together, at the water crossing the lowest part of the yard, now cold and purposeful, sheeting across the ground toward the cabin foundation. The sycamores along the bank stood in a foot of water. Above them, the three-quarter moon had the specific cold clarity of light that has no warmth to offer. "Is this where it was in 1993?" she asked. "Close." He watched the surface. But 1993 was a sustained flood, 6 days of continuous rainfall on a saturated watershed. This is a pulse. Sharp peak, then it falls. He said what came next without false comfort, in the specific tone of an engineer giving honest information. "The peak should come within the next hour. Then it recedes." "Should," she said. "Should," he agreed. They stood on the porch in an inch of water, the yard completely submerged now, the sycamores standing in river water that had crossed the bank and spread across the clearing, and they waited together in the particular silence that forms between two people who have done what they can and are now in the territory of forces larger than what they can influence. Walt broke the silence quietly. "Your father was here during the 1993 flood," he said. She looked at him. "He called me afterward. We had been corresponding for 2 years by then. He wrote, standing in the water, watching the river do what it has always done. I find it impossible to maintain the illusion that human decisions about this river are permanent. The river doesn't know about Truman Dam. It just keeps doing what it was doing before the dam existed." Nora looked at the moving water around the porch steps. "He wrote that to you," she said. "In a letter, June 1993, I have it still." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father wrote very good letters." "He was precise about words," she said. "He thought imprecise language was a form of disrespect, to the reader and to the subject." "He was precise about everything that mattered," Walt said. "The research he left you, he worked on it every summer for 4 years. He drove 3 hours each way from Jefferson City. He corresponded with Thomas every month. He built something with no institutional support and no guarantee of recognition and no professional audience because he believed it needed to exist." A pause. "That's a particular kind of courage. Not dramatic, just steady." She stood on the porch of the cabin her grandfather had built beside a man who had spent 50 years trying to account for a decision made at 26, watching a river her father had loved past the point of reason, and spent his final years trying to make the world acknowledge. And she understood completely in her body, in the specific way that real understanding becomes permanent, what she was doing here. Steadiness is inherited. Not automatically, not without choosing it. But if you pay attention, and if you choose it, it passes from one person to the next, like everything else that is worth passing. The river peaked at 4:07 in the morning, 49 inches, 2 inches below the 1993 high water mark. She read the peg herself twice, crouching at the northeast corner with river water cold around the top of her boots, the flashlight beam on the gradations. 49, she said. Walt let out a single long breath. That's the peak. They waited 15 minutes in the particular silence of people who are not yet sure the thing is over. At 4:22, she read the peg again. 48. The river was falling. Dawn came gradually, not an event, but a slow revision of the dark, the sky shifting from black to blue-gray to the pale gold of an Ozark morning after a night that had been too much. 6 inches of standing water in the yard. Debris on the porch steps. The shed threshold wet but not breached. The cabin floor completely dry. The foundation had held. She brought the research bins in from the trunk. She opened them at the work table and checked every item methodically the way her father would have. The maps were dry. The notebooks were dry. The photographs were dry. The duct tape seams had held against everything the river had offered. Walt brought coffee without being asked. He set one cup beside her and took his to the window with the expression of a man who finds the aftermath of a serious situation easier to be present for than the situation itself. Because in the aftermath, there is evidence of what held. She looked at the last map, the unfinished one, the one that had the notation clipped to it in her father's handwriting, "This matters." She picked up his mechanical pencil, the Pentel P205 she had been reaching for reflexively since her first day at the work table, without knowing precisely why. She had not noticed until the fourth day. She had not stopped. She found the confirmation point on the map, the spring on the north tributary, the location she had now visited a dozen times, the configuration of red limestone and cedar overhang, and cold water that Thomas had recognized from three families' oral tradition, and that Walt could explain in hydrological terms that told the same story from a different direction. She checked the coordinates 3 times against the survey data with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who does not ink things in until she is certain. She was certain. She inked in the confirmation point. Then she moved to the next mark, and the next. Her hand was completely steady. Thomas came on Thursday, 2 days after the flood, driving carefully through still muddy roads, parking and looking at the debris line on the porch steps without a word. The question in his expression was clear. "I stayed," she said. He came inside. He stood at the work table. He looked at the last map, previously unfinished, now substantially advanced in her hand. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You used his pencil," he said finally. "Same model." She paused. "I verified every coordinate 3 times before I inked." He nodded, and from his leather portfolio, he removed 3 photographs and laid them on the table beside the map. Black and white archival prints, the specific quality of photographs made with the intention that they last. The first showed a section of riverbank. The second showed a limestone spring emerging from a rock face with a cedar overhang. The third showed a cleared area on an elevated bank, 2 structures visible at the edges. "These are from the Cultural Center's archives," Thomas said. "Taken in 1921 by a federal surveyor documenting land use patterns in advance of the allotment process." He was quiet for a moment. The surveyor was documenting what he intended to eliminate. He pointed to the second photograph. Nora looked at it. The configuration of rock and cedar and the particular way the water emerged from the limestone fissure was exact. She knew this spring with the knowledge of someone who has paid close, repeated attention to a thing, knew it in her body, the way you know a place you have walked to often enough that your feet know the route before your mind does. "That's our spring," she said. "Yes." He moved his finger to the third photograph. "And this is the winter habitation site. As of 1921, it was still in active use." His finger traced the elevated bank's edge. "Not continuously by then, after removal and allotment intermittently, but used, within living memory of 1921. She understood immediately what this meant for the argument. Not just confirmation transformation. An active use site within living memory triggers different review requirements under federal law. Requirements that the State Archaeological Survey cannot unilaterally ignore. Her father had not had these photographs. He had submitted twice without them and been turned away twice. With them, the filing entered an entirely different legal and procedural category. "This changes the federal review threshold," she said, significantly. Thomas looked at her. "Your father did not have these photographs. I found them 6 weeks ago in a collection we received from a private donor. I was waiting for the right moment." "This is the right moment," she said. "We file by the end of the month. Can you revise the argument by then?" "Monday," she said. Walt, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during this exchange, set 3 cups of coffee on the work table without comment. He picked up the 1921 photograph of the spring and looked at it for a long time, holding it at the angle of a man who is reading something he has been trying to read for 50 years and is finally close enough to see it clearly. 90 years before it should have been documented," he said. 100 years before anyone asked the right people the right questions," Thomas said. There was no bitterness in his voice. It was a statement of fact, carrying the full weight of a fact that has been true for a very long time, and whose truth has cost something that cannot be returned. Walt set the photograph down precisely where he had taken it from. "It's being documented now," he said. "The filing deadline was the end of May. She made it by 6 days." Thomas submitted through the official channels the Osage Nation Cultural Center as the primary institutional applicant, Nora Calloway as lead researcher, Walter Briggs as technical consultant in hydrology and historical land use. The argument was 23 pages, with the 14 maps, the annotated source index, the 3 archival photographs, Walt's hydrological analysis, and because Nora had called her daughter and Claire had driven down from St. Louis in a pair of bright green rubber boots that were clearly new and clearly making their displeasure known, a plain language summary, 2 pages written for people who are not historians and need to understand why something matters before they can be asked to care. Claire arrived with a small overnight bag and the look of someone who has finally given herself permission to show up without knowing exactly why it took this long. She stood outside her rental car and looked at the cabin and the sycamores and the river below the bank with the expression of someone encountering a place they have heard about their entire life and are only now understanding what it actually was. "I bought wellies," she said. "I can see that. They hurt. They'll break in." Nora looked at her daughter, the dark hair and the precise, organized intelligence, and the spine she had given her, the same one she had received from Marcus. "Come inside, I want to show you something." Claire stood in the doorway and looked at the work table. Maps spread everywhere. Open notebooks. The 1921 photographs pinned to the board above. The typed argument in its final draft. The density of organized, serious, ongoing work. She was quiet for a moment that was not a short moment. "This is real research," she said. "It was always real research," Nora said. "Your grandfather built it. I'm finishing it." Claire walked to the table. She picked up the 3rd map, the one showing the spring, and studied it with the same quiet thoroughness she applied to everything. She had never skimmed in her life. It had occasionally been inconvenient. "Grandpa drew these," she said, "by hand over 4 summers. And this notation here," she pointed to the confirmation point, the ink slightly different from the surrounding marks. "Mine," Nora said. "Everything else is his." Claire set the map down with the care of someone who has concluded that this object belongs to a category above ordinary documents. She looked at the mechanical pencil in the supply cup on the table. "His pencil," she said. "His model, same one I used in graduate school." A pause. "He liked it too." Claire looked at her mother with an expression that would have been difficult to describe precisely, but was somewhere between the acknowledgement of having been wrong about something and the specific relief of being glad to have been wrong. "I told Dad you were isolating," she said. "I know. I was wrong." "You were worried," Nora said without the edge that could have been there. "Worried people operate with incomplete information. That's not a flaw. It's love doing the best it can with what it has." A silence. The river below the window back in its banks now running clear again. "Then, what do you need for the project that you don't have yet?" It was a Claire question. Not "are you okay," not "is this hard," but "what do you need?" The administrative intelligence that was her daughter's particular gift. "The Federal Review filing requires a plain language summary," Nora said. 2 pages, accessible to non-historians. I write for academic audiences. I know how to make an argument rigorous. Plain language is a different skill. Claire picked up the draft argument and read the first page. Then she set it down. "Show me the federal summary requirements. I write plain language policy summaries for hospital boards every month. The skill is transferable." They worked until 10 o'clock. The lamp on, the river moving in the dark outside. The 2 Calloway women across the work table from each other, the mother's historical precision, and the daughter's policy writer's clarity, finding the same argument from different angles until both angles met in the same 2 pages. Nora thought this is exactly the right use of 2 people. Daniel called in June, 3 weeks after the filing. He had heard about the project from Claire, and Nora had concluded after consideration that if the work was going to go anywhere, it needed as many informed people as possible. And Daniel, whatever the years between them had made of things, had spent his career as a civil engineer and understood federal review processes better than most. Nora. His voice had the careful graciousness of someone who has decided to be generous about a call he has been wondering about. "Claire told me about the research." "I thought you should hear it from me," she said, "so you can stop worrying." "I was worried," he said. "I know." A pause. "She sent me the filed argument. All 23 pages. Another pause. "For an independent, non-institutional submission, the methodology is extremely rigorous. My father built the foundation," she said. "I know how to construct an argument from primary sources. That's what I spent my career teaching." "He knew that," Daniel said. His voice shifted into something quieter, something that had been sitting in him for a while. "He told me at Claire's birthday 2 years before he died. He said Nora is wasted on high school. He didn't mean it as an insult. He meant the opposite, that the work she could do if she had time and the right problem would be different. A pause. I didn't repeat it because I didn't want you to feel pressured. She sat with this for a moment. Her father, 2 years before his death at their daughter's birthday dinner, telling her ex-husband what he had not yet found the right way to tell her directly. He was working up to it, she said. I think he was, Daniel said. I'm sorry he ran out of time. He left me enough, she said. She looked at the work table. I'm finishing it. I know. A pause. For what it's worth, I was wrong to frame what you did as a crisis. You made the right call. This was for Daniel a significant statement. He revised his positions on evidence, and he did not do it publicly unless he meant it. Thank you, she said. That genuinely matters. What happens next, he said. She told him. He listened with an engineer's attention, tracking the sequence, noting the dependencies. Before they hung up, he said, if you need someone to review the technical hydrology sections before a subsequent filing, I know a civil engineer at MU who consults for the Corps. I already have one, she said, but I'll keep the offer. Good. A brief pause. Take care of yourself, Nora. I always do, she said. That's occasionally the issue. She heard him almost laugh, the sound of someone encountering a familiar thing from a different angle and finding it unexpectedly pleasant. One of their old jokes from the years when her self-sufficiency had been something he found charming, rather than something that had made it impossible for them to need each other in the ways that marriages require. Goodbye, Daniel, she said. Goodbye, he said. She sat with the phone in her hand and the late afternoon light on the maps on the work table, and she thought about the word goodbye and all the different weights it carries depending on what it is putting to rest. This one had the comfortable weight of something that had finished cleanly on the terms of two people who had once been important to each other and had managed over time to become something more forgiving than that. That was not nothing. It was actually a form of grace. Dr. Amelia Sato arrived in July with a graduate student and a photographer driving a university vehicle, and she moved through the cabin property with the focused, directed attention of someone who has spent 20 years reading Midwest landscapes for evidence and has a very clear idea of what she is looking for and what she will do when she finds it. She was in her mid-40s, compact and precise in the field, with the quality of someone who has learned to be decisive in terrain where indecision is its own kind of data loss. She listened to Thomas's explanation of the oral tradition accounts with the full attention of a researcher who has spent enough time in the field to understand that the things communities carry forward in memory are not decoration. They are data of a kind that written documents are frequently not equipped to capture. At the spring, she stopped for a long time. She took measurements. She photographed the rock face from 6 angles. She crouched at the spring's edge and watched the water's behavior, the way it emerged, the volume and consistency of the flow, what the flow rate implied about the aquifer above. She consulted her notes, then Thomas's cultural center documentation, then her notes again. She did not perform any of this for their benefit. She was simply working the way serious people work when they are not thinking about how they appear. On the third day, standing on the elevated bank above the north tributary, with summer light cutting horizontally through the sycamores, she said, "The winter habitation hypothesis is robustly supported. The landform evidence is internally consistent and matches your father's documentation completely. The 1921 photographs confirm active use past the removal period, which meets the continuous connection threshold." She paused. "This site qualifies for formal assessment under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. That's not a state archaeological survey question anymore. This is a federal question." Nora had known this theoretically since Thomas had laid the 3 photographs on the work table. But there is a distance between knowing something theoretically and hearing it stated plainly by a field archaeologist who has stood at the spring and walked the property and reviewed the documentation and arrived at an independent conclusion. "My father submitted to the state survey twice," she said. Dr. Sato's voice was even but not neutral. "I know. He was right both times. The state simply lacked the institutional will to say so." She looked at the spring through the tree line. "This site should have been formally recognized 30 years ago. We are here now." Nora stood at the tributary's edge and thought about her father making the same walk in his last June, writing 3 words in a half-finished notebook, leaving the whole thing for someone who would come in the right time. "You patient, patient man, you were right. You were right the whole time." "What do you need from me for the federal assessment filing?" she asked. "What you've already built. Dr. Sato said. The documented argument, the source index, the hydrological analysis, plus our field report and the cultural center certification. She paused. Who wrote the plain language summary in the existing filing, the two-page federal review summary? My daughter, Nora said. She does policy summaries for hospital boards. Dr. Sato looked at her with the expression that said, of course. It's the clearest 2 pages of review documentation I've read in 20 years. She should write the summary for the federal assessment filing as well. I'll tell her, Nora said. She'll consider it a reasonable use of a law degree. Her brother Paul arrived in August. He drove up from Springfield on a Wednesday morning alone, without being asked, having apparently concluded at some point in the preceding months that whatever was happening at the Osage cabin was something he needed to see for himself. He was 4 years younger than Nora Broader through the middle, with their father's wide hands and the specific cheerfulness of a man who had always known his role in the family was not to be the intense one, and had built an entire identity around being glad of this. He sat on the porch for 2 hours while Nora explained the project. He was quiet for most of it, not restless, but quiet in the particular way of people whose attention is more receptive than it looks. He did not interrupt. He did not offer opinions while she was still establishing the facts. When she finished, he looked at the last map, all 14 marks inked in the Winter Village site delineated in the notation their father had developed, and she had continued. Dad did all this, he said, over 4 summers, alone. Mostly. He was quiet for a moment. Why didn't he tell me? Not accusatory. The honest question of a man who had loved his father without always speaking the same language. I think, Nora said carefully, he didn't know how to explain it without explaining everything first. And everything was going to take a very long time. She looked at the map. He left it for the person who could finish the argument. That turned out to be me, but he loved you in a different way, the way you love someone who doesn't need the project explained in order to be worth knowing. Paul sat with this. That's a kind thing to say, he said. It's accurate. They're often the same thing. He stayed for dinner. He helped with the dishes afterward, cheerful, domestically capable, finding usefulness, relaxing in a way that was entirely his own. Then he stood in the doorway of the work table room and looked at the spread of research materials and said without preamble, "What can I do?" She had not expected it. "I don't know anything about Osage history," he said, "or river hydrology or federal review processes." He paused. "But I spent 30 years in insurance, and I know how institutional processes work when the institution would prefer that things stay unresolved. I know the anatomy of a claim that's being quietly allowed to die." He looked at her directly. "And I'm very good at the follow-up." She looked at her brother, the Springfield house, the Buick, the same wide hands their father had. She had never noticed that detail before, that it was a category they shared. "The State Archaeological Survey has had our certified copy for 6 weeks, she said. They have been under review for the entire duration." 6 weeks, Paul said in the tone of a man who has processed 6-week delays on insurance claims many times and knows precisely what that language means in practice. "They prefer to let things settle," she said. "They prefer it when people stop calling." "They won't prefer it," Paul said pleasantly, "after I've called 4 times. Paul called 4 times. He was thorough about each call, not aggressive, not hostile, but comprehensively specific about timelines and documentation requirements and the particular obligations that a certified filing creates for the receiving institution. He kept notes. He sent follow-up emails confirming what had been said. He called again. The State Archaeological Survey sent an official response in the first week of September. Not a form letter. 3 pages signed by the director herself acknowledging the evidence, flagging the 1921 photographic documentation as material that had not been available in the prior submissions and requesting a formal meeting with the research team in October. Nora read the letter standing at the work table at 7 in the morning before her first cup of coffee still in her jacket from checking the reference peg. She read it twice. She sat down. She sat for a long time in the quiet cabin with the river outside, and the fall morning coming gold through the east window, and her father's maps on the table around her. Not triumph, triumph was too simple and too loud for what this was. Not relief, which implied doubt she had not felt. Something quieter than both. The specific sensation of a thing finding its correct location after a long time of being in the wrong one. She called Thomas. "I have the survey's official response," she said. A pause. "Read it to me." She read all 3 pages. He was silent through every word. When she finished, the silence on his end had the quality of a man standing at the edge of something he has been working toward for a long time and is only now certain is real. Your father submitted twice, he said finally. He was right twice, she said. The record says so now. The October meeting at the State Archaeological Survey was on a Thursday. Nora drove to Jefferson City with Thomas in the passenger seat and Walt following in the F-150. She drove through the same streets she had driven every day for 31 years past the exits she had taken to get to the school. She noticed these things with the neutral attention of someone who has finished one chapter and is occupied with what comes next. The meeting room held 7 people on the institutional side. The director, a woman in her early 60s named Harriet Drummond, with the alert, careful manner of someone who has been in a bureaucratic institution long enough to have developed the ability to be simultaneously cautious and genuinely sharp. 2 senior archaeologists, an attorney from the State Heritage Law Division, and the fact that altered the room's balance of authority, a representative from the Federal Review Office who had driven down from Kansas City. A federal representative attending a state meeting means the state's process now has an audience that outranks it. Nora presented the written argument. Walt presented the hydrological analysis. Thomas presented the cultural center's position on the oral tradition evidence and its relationship to the physical record. The director asked precise questions and received precise answers. The attorney asked the guarded questions of someone protecting an institution's legal exposure. The federal representative asked the question that in a different kind of meeting would have been asked first, what is the appropriate outcome here? Nora answered directly. Formal recognition of the winter habitation site under the National Historic Preservation Act with a comprehensive boundary assessment that includes the spring and the north tributary, and a recommendation to the Federal Review Office for inclusion in the Osage Removal Historical Record. She paused. My father submitted this evidence to this survey twice. He was correct both times. The documentation now satisfies every criterion the survey requires, and the federal threshold is clearly and demonstrably met. She looked at Harriet Drummond directly. The appropriate outcome is to say so. The director looked at her for a moment. You're a history teacher, she said. Retired, Nora said, which gives me time to be thorough. Something shifted in Harriet Drummond's expression. Not capitulation, but the specific recognition of a person who is unusually exactly as prepared as they claim to be. We'll send our formal response within 30 days, the director said. It will recommend the federal assessment. A sentence, an official contained bureaucratic sentence with no drama in it. It was enough. The survey's formal response arrived in 26 days. It recommended the federal assessment. And in a paragraph in the middle section, the institutional equivalent of admitting fault, which government bodies produce at approximately the rate of pulling teeth, it acknowledged that the 2 prior submissions from Marcus Calloway had presented evidence consistent with the current findings, and that the delay in formal response had been procedurally suboptimal. Paul read this paragraph over the phone and was aesthetically offended. Procedurally suboptimal, he repeated. It's in the permanent record, Nora said. The permanent record states that my father was right. He deserved to know it while he was alive. Yes, she said, he did. She was quiet for a moment. But he knew it without them telling him. He knew it because he had done the work to the standard where knowing is not a matter of hope, it's a matter of evidence. He knew it every time he stood at that spring. She paused. He just needed someone to finish the argument. That's all any of us can do. Build as far as we can build and leave the rest for someone who comes after. Thanksgiving at the cabin. Walt came on the evening with a roasted chicken and a bottle of wine. Because it's a holiday, he said, and I decided the occasion warranted it. And they ate at the table by the window with the wood stove going and the river dark and cold outside. What do you do now? She asked him when the plates had been cleared. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Walt Briggs at 71, with his long accounting, with the river now in the process of being paid in the most permanent way he had found. He looked at the work table across the room. I'm teaching a course, he said, at the community college in Nevada, Missouri. Water systems management. Twice a year. A pause. I'm adding a unit. Pre-contact river use. The land knowledge of the people who managed these systems for centuries before the Corps arrived. He looked at her. I need someone to review the materials. I don't know history. I know hydrology. They need to be the same story. Send me the drafts, she said. I know, he said. Epilogue. The Winter Workshop series started in December. Nora's idea, presented to the Shell City Historical Society in October, accepted with the cautious enthusiasm of a local institution that is not accustomed to being approached with something quite like this. A local history workshop, 4 sessions open to anyone in Vernon County, focused on the Osage River Valley from pre-contact to the present. 14 people came to the first session. She had expected 12. 14 people in a community room in Shell City, Missouri on a December Tuesday evening. Farmers, retirees, a middle school teacher, a man who had fished the Osage for 40 years without knowing what the river had been before he was born. 14 people sitting with her father's maps laid out on folding tables around the perimeter of the room, learning for the first time the specific and continuous and long-suppressed history of the land they lived on. They did not leave unchanged. She could see it in the particular way that people listen when they encounter information that reorganizes something they thought they already knew. The stillness, the leaning forward, the questions at the end that are not skeptical but are trying to understand what to do with what they have just been given. She had seen this in classrooms for 31 years. It still worked on her. In the spring of the following year, while the federal survey team was conducting its preliminary site work along the North Tributary, she found the fourth notebook. She had been moving the canvas chair to give the survey team access to the front window when it slid partway from the chair's side pocket, a small notebook. Different from the 3 field notebooks bound in worn brown covers, her father's handwriting on the front, in the tight, deliberate script he used for things he wanted to make clear. She sat down in the chair. She opened it, not a field notebook. A different kind, the kind you keep for thinking rather than recording. The inside account of what it had actually felt like to spend 4 summers in this cabin building something the world had not yet decided to acknowledge. He had written about the frustrations, the survey rejections, the form letters, the institutional indifference that settles around work that has no institutional home. He had written about the cold field mornings and the conversations with Thomas, and the specific dignity, he used the word dignity underlined, of working seriously on something that might not go anywhere because the work was still worth doing whether it went anywhere or not. And in the last pages, the entries from his final June, he had written about her. Not the project, her. He had written about the 31 years she had spent in classrooms making students understand why history mattered. He had written about watching her grow into the kind of teacher who does the work because the work is true, not because the institution rewards it. He had written about the specific quiet courage of someone who has given 30 years to a single sustained argument that the past is not past, that the obligation of understanding is always the same, that what happened matters because it is still happening, and has made that argument not once or twice, but every day to a new audience, with the willingness to keep making it even when the audience does not yet understand why they should care. He had written, she will know what to do with this. She will know because she has been doing it all her life with different material. The material is here now. The argument is built. I am only waiting for the right time to give it to her. And then in the final entry dated June 1st, 2 days before he died. The work takes as long as it takes. You cannot make the river run faster. You can only watch it carefully and record what you see and give the record to the person who will know what to do with it. That is what a historian does. That is what I have done. That is what she will do. I am not worried. She sat in the canvas chair with the fourth notebook in her hands for a long time. Through the window, the federal survey team moved along the North Tributary in their official, methodical way, measuring and documenting, doing the formal work of acknowledgement that her father had spent 4 years building toward without knowing whether anyone would ever do it. You patient man, she thought. You extraordinary patient man. You were right. She opened the fourth notebook to the first blank page. She reached for her father's pencil. She began to take notes. The Smithsonian exhibition opened the following March. 3 rooms in the museum's American History Wing. Nora flew to Washington. Claire came. Thomas came. Walt drove up in the F-150 by a route he had planned himself and didn't explain. The exhibition was called Beneath the Current Indigenous Land Histories of the American Midwest. The Callaway Briggs research maps occupied the central display, all 14 reproduced at full scale, her father's drafting hand, in every line her own notation at the confirmation point, visible to anyone who knew to look for it. She stood in the gallery on the opening evening and read her own words on the wall. The maps in this exhibition were made by Marcus Callaway, a retired high school history teacher from Jefferson City, Missouri, who spent the last 4 years of his life documenting a history that most Americans have never thought to ask about. He was not a credentialed archaeologist. He was a man who believed that paying attention is the most important thing a person can do, and that the world rewards it with more than you can use in one lifetime. He died in June 2021 before the work was formally acknowledged. The work has since been acknowledged. The river was always there. Claire stood beside her and read it. "You wrote that," she said. "He lived it," Nora said. "You both did," Claire said. "That's what the exhibition actually is, isn't it? It's the Osage history, but it's also the history of who pays attention and why and what it costs and what it's worth." Nora looked at her daughter, the dark hair and the precise mind and the same spine and the intelligence she had not known was this particular shape until this exact moment. "You should have been a history teacher," Nora said. "I thought about it," Claire said. "I decided hospital administration had better hours." A pause. "I was wrong about the hours. You're good at what you do." "So are you." Claire looked at the maps. "You always were. You just didn't have the right subject yet." Nora thought about 31 years of good work in classrooms that were not quite the right room, and the 7 months of better work on a river that was. The difference between a person who has found the correct application for their particular competence and a person who has not found it yet. The gap that closes when you finally stop being afraid of what waits on the other side of the right decision. "He knew before I did," she said. "Fathers usually do," Claire said in the tone of a woman who expects to understand this better when she is older. Nora put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. They stood together in the gallery and looked at the map's 14 sections of a valley's history. The documentation of a people's presence, the evidence of what had been done to that presence and what it had survived, all of it drawn in the careful hand of a man who had decided that normal was unacceptable and had spent 4 years proving why. The federal site assessment was formally completed in June, 1 year almost to the day after Nora had pulled up the gravel lane and stopped the car in the clearing and stood in the presence of everything her father had been and left behind. Thomas called at 7 in the morning. She was already at the work table. "It's done," he said. "The winter habitation site is formally recognized. The boundary assessment includes the spring and the north tributary. The Osage Nation's territorial documentation of the site is now in the Federal Register." She looked out the window at the river running at its early summer level clear and green over the gravel, the wood ducks back on the far margin, the kingfisher working the near bank with the complete singular efficiency of something that has one job and does it with its whole self. "My father submitted twice," she said. "He was right twice," Thomas said. "The record says so now." She hung up. She picked up her pencil. She opened her own notebook, started in May, the year she had arrived, and she wrote, "June. The federal assessment is complete. The site is formally recognized. The river is running at proper early summer level. The workshop series ended in April. The second series begins in September 31, registered already. Walt's course now includes 3 sessions on pre-contact land use. The journal article with Thomas and Dr. Sato goes to press next week. Claire is coming in July. Paul calls on Tuesdays. Dr. Sato's graduate student, the one who chose the field name Marcus, is doing his dissertation on Osage land use in the Lake of the Ozarks watershed. He asked if I would serve on his committee. I said yes. She stopped. She looked out at the river. "Dad, the river remembers. So does the Federal Register now. So will the journal article and the exhibition catalog and Walt's course notes and the 31 people coming to the fall workshop and whoever comes after them. You were right. It takes as long as it takes. We finished it." She walked to the spring that afternoon. The same walk she had made 100 times since May of the previous year, down the bank east along the tributary 200 yards to where the limestone rose through the soil and the spring emerged from the rock face in its steady, cold, unhurried thread. She stood at the spring without measuring it, without photographing it, without recording anything. She had done all of that. The record was complete. She simply stood and listened to the water come out of the stone. The water that remembers. The spring that had been here before the Osage named it and would be here after the last paper about it was filed. The physical fact of a place that had been known and loved and lost and found again, not because the water had ever stopped running, because it hadn't, because nothing stops the water, but because someone had finally stood in the right place and been still enough to hear what it was saying. Her father had stood here and heard it. She stood here and heard it too. She took out her notebook. She wrote 3 words. Then she closed the notebook and stood in the good cool air of the spring and let the sound be enough. The way sounds are enough when you have stopped waiting for them to mean something and have simply allowed them to mean what they are. The spring ran. The river ran. Nora Calloway stood at the edge of a correctly documented history and understood that she was not finished. Not even close. The 3 words she had written, "This is the place." The exhibition ran for 8 months. 14 people came to the first workshop in Shell City. By the 4th session, it was 31 farmers who had grown up fishing the Osage without knowing what the river had been, Retirees who had lived in Vernon County their whole lives and were learning for the first time that the land under their feet had a history 1,000 years deeper than anything they had been taught. A middle school teacher who came to the first session and stayed for all four and asked Nora afterward if she would be willing to come to her classroom in the spring. "Of course," Nora said. "Do you charge?" the teacher asked. "I'm retired," Nora said, "which means I've stopped charging for things that matter." The middle school visit happened in April. 22 seventh graders in a classroom in Shell City, sitting with copies of the simplified maps Thomas had prepared for educational use. Learning that the river outside the window had been a home and a highway and a food source and a landmark for people who had named every bend and bar and tributary in it long before the town of Shell City existed. One boy asked, "Why didn't we learn this before?" Nora considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because the people who write curricula have to decide what to include," she said. "And the people who decide what to include are not always the people who know what matters." She paused. "That's one of the things that can change, if people know to ask for it." The boy thought about this. "Can we ask for it?" he said. That what Nora said is exactly the right question. Paul calls on Tuesdays. Walt's course now runs 3 times a year. Instead of twice, the demand exceeded the original schedule, which Walt reported with the satisfaction of a man who has found that the thing he built is larger than he planned for. Dr. Sato's graduate student who had asked to be called Marcus on his first day at the spring site and had made the request with the seriousness of a 26-year-old who has decided what matters defended his dissertation in February. Nora was on his committee. He thanked her in his acknowledgments, and he thanked Marcus Calloway by name, and he thanked the Osage Nation Cultural Center, and he thanked the spring on the North Tributary. He thanked the spring. She had not expected that. It was entirely correct. She thinks about her father most clearly in the early mornings, before the light is fully established, when the river is just audible through the open window, and the work table is the first thing she sees when she opens her eyes. She thinks about a man who spent 30 years in a classroom doing good work, and then spent 4 more years in this cabin doing the work that turned out to be the right work, and who trusted on the evidence of 3 decades of watching the person she had become that she would know what to do with what he had left. He had not been wrong. She has not been wrong either, as far as she can tell. Not about resigning, not about the cabin, not about the box, not about any of the decisions that brought her from room 214 at Jefferson Lincoln Regional High School to a work table on the Osage River where the light comes in right in the morning and the river tells you things if you pay attention, and the work is never quite finished. She is not finished. She is, in fact, only beginning to understand the scale of what there is to do. The breadth of the history that has been underdocumented, underacknowledged, actively suppressed, quietly allowed to disappear. The Osage River Valley is not an isolated case. It is one river in one state. There are other rivers, there are other valleys, there are other retired history teachers who have not yet found the right box. She is writing a guide for them. It is not finished either. She thinks Marcus would find this entirely appropriate.